Hello guys, I have one of the most broken builds I've ever seen today on this channel, and it is what I have to say one of the best Necromancer builds in the game currently. This Necromancer build lets you pull in enemies and one-shot them over and over and over and over again. You can even one-shot high-tier bosses in Nightmare dungeons and run through tier 70, 80, and even 90 Nightmare dungeons completely tested. This Necromancer build is the Infinite Shadow Mist build, or the Infinimist build, by AliGotRange. He reached out to me and wanted to showcase this build, so we're going to go through it right now because after him showing me this build, it is completely ridiculous. Make sure you guys check out his YouTube in the description down below, and also feel free to add him on PSN at, again, AliGotRange down below. He's perfected this build and made it incredible. As you can see, you're literally able to run solo content and just destroy everything without even hardly trying. The build almost single-handedly makes you invulnerable and lets you proc millions and millions of damage on corpse explosions on all enemies at almost all times. And really quick before we go into how to set this up, I am giving this away to you guys. I'm giving away this beautiful Asus ROG Ally to you. Asus teamed up with me to bring you their state-of-the-art Asus ROG Ally that is literally a portable PC right in your hands. It runs a Ryzen Zen 4 processor, a 512GB NVMe drive with a 7-inch Full HD 120Hz screen, and I was able to load up Steam to play any game I wanted and load up the Battle.net launcher and run Diablo straight on it and play whenever I'm away from my computer and take it wherever I want, or even be productive and do some work since it is a computer. And you can win this Asus ROG Ally super easy. All you have to do is like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below Diablo 4 and your favorite tip from this video. You also get a second entry by visiting the link below for the primary giveaway video if you do the exact same thing over there. That being said, make sure you get your 2 entries in because this isn't going to go for long. But firstly, we're going to go over the skills, and I'm going to show you the important skills and what you need to take to make this build so incredibly overpowered. And also make sure you follow along. Below in the description is a build guide, so you can save that one and follow it as I'm going and use it to reference back to later. So for our basic skill, we're going to take Reap here. We're going to use this as our basic attack, and it provides us damage reduction as well. And here we're going to go into Enhanced Reap for the additional attack speed, and Acolyte's Reap, which forms a corpse under the first enemy hit, which can only occur every 4 seconds. This is going to be one of our abilities we use to generate corpses pretty consistently. And then we're going to take out of here 3 out of 3 for Hewed Flesh. This makes this unlucky hit. You have a 12% chance to create a corpse at the target's location. This is going to allow us to generate corpses even faster to power our big damage abilities, Corpse Explosion and Corpse Tendrils. Next, we're going to jump over here and take Bloodmist. This is going to be one of our key abilities that makes us invincible for a large amount of time and is one of our keys to this build. Once you can see, when Bloodmist is active, you become immune completely for 3 seconds, meaning you can't be damaged during those 3 seconds, and additionally granting you unstoppable. Now this is going to be the ability we use to constantly stay alive while waiting to proc our big hits on enemies, and it's going to offer you complete protection. Now we want 5 out of 5 in Bloodmist since it's one of our main abilities, and then we're going to want to go to Enhance Bloodmist, and then we're going to want to go into Ghastly Bloodmist, so Bloodmist leaves behind a corpse every 1 second. Again, increasing our corpse generation so that way on our corpse explosions we deal massive amounts of damage. Now skills and aspects later will help us detonate these corpses. Again, this is one of our bread and butter skills because it makes us invincible and it plays into our corpse explosion huge damage abilities very, very well. Next, we're going to want to grab 5 out of 5 for Corpse Explosion. Now Corpse Explosion works to explode corpses, dealing a certain amount of shadow damage over 6 seconds. Now once you grab maximum points in Corpse Explosion, also additional points from our equipment that we'll go over here in just a minute, you're going to be maximizing the amount of damage you do with your corpses, which is basically going to be our primary damage ability. Now additionally, you do want to grab Enhanced Corpse Explosion to increase the radius by 15% to do additional damage outwards, and also Blighted Corpse Explosion so that the Corpse Explosion becomes a darkness skill, and instead of exploding releases an attack that deals a certain amount of shadow damage over 6 seconds. Now because we make this a darkness skill, you'll see with some of our skills later on, this synergizes very well with the rest of the skill set. Next, we're going to want to jump over to Grim Harvest, and this is mainly used as a stepping stone to get to the Fueled by Death passive, where you do a 9% increased damage for 6 seconds after consuming a corpse. Next, we're going to want to grab Death's Embrace. This is another passive for damage, so close enemies take 6% more damage from you and deal 9% less damage, giving you very much needed damage reduction for higher tiers. And we also want to take Amplified Damage here, so that way you deal 12% increased damage to cursed enemies, and basically we're going to be cursing all of our enemies with the skill set, overall giving us a flat 12% damage buff across the board most all of the time. And then we want to take Decrepify. So Decrepify is going to curse the target area, so enemies that are afflicted with Decrepify are slowed by 50% and deal 23 to 24% less damage. which is going to give you a great amount of damage reduction and apply slow to the target. Now we do also want to take Enhanced Decrepify, so that way on lucky hits, enemies hit while afflicted with Decrepify will have up to a 10% chance to be stunned for 2 seconds. And then we're going to go into Abhorrent Decrepify, so that on lucky hit, enemies are actually going to help us give chance to reduce our active cooldowns by 1 second. And essentially when we group up big amounts of enemies, our lucky hit chance is so high, we're going to be constantly reducing our cooldowns by 1 second, giving us close to infinite uptime on Bloodmist. So Decrepify here is the perfect skill to constantly reduce our cooldowns for our skills and keep Bloodmist up as much as humanly possible. Additionally, we're going to want to grab the Reaper's Pursuit passive. This is going to give us increased movement speed when damaging enemies with darkness. We also want 1 out of 3 for Crippling Darkness, where our darkness skills have up to a 15% chance to stun enemies for 1 second. This stun chance also helps with staggering bosses very well, and in general just more CC. And then we want Terror, so this is going to give us multiplicative stacking damage to our corpse explosions whenever we actually slow through Decrepify and Tendrils, as well as the stacking damage from Tendrils stuns. Now again, you can see here it's going to give that 9% bonus damage to enemies who are slowed and bonus damage to enemies who are stunned or immobilized. And again, those bonuses stack and apply shadow damage dealt by your minions, which means we can deal up to an 18% additional damage here. You want 3 out of 3 here. And then we're going to want 3 out of 3 for Gloom. And Gloom is going to give us a multiplicative stacking to our damage. They take 6% increased shadow damage from you and your minions, which can stack up to 3 times, giving us an additional 18% stacked damage almost all of the time on enemies, again multiplying and making our damage numbers even higher than before. Now we also want to take Corpse Tendrils. This is going to be one of our primary abilities again. This is going to be an ability that pulls in enemies and stuns them for 3 seconds and deals a certain amount of damage to them, but the idea here is it pulls them all together in a big group. This is an essential skill and gives infinite CC with our cooldown resets, gives vulnerable, and groups enemies for our corpse explosions to do massive damage and wipe out every enemy on your screen basically at once. Now again, here we do want to take this into Enhanced Corpse Tendrils. That way enemies who are in range of Corpse Tendrils actually get slowed on top of this, and then Plagued Corpse Tendrils, which again makes it so enemies damaged by Corpse Tendrils are made vulnerable for 3 seconds. So enemies are made vulnerable just before the corpse explosions, so that way we do massive damage to all enemies that are grouped in this tight circle. We also want to take 2 out of 3 for the passive Necrotic Carapace. This is going to make it so that way when we use any one of our abilities prior to actually form a corpse, this is going to give us Fortify for 4% of our base life, making us extremely tanky on top of this and our invincibility from Bloodmist. Additionally, you want to take the standalone passive here. This is going to increase our damage reduction by 18%. And then we also want 3 out of 3 for Memento Mori, so that way sacrificing both Skeletal Warriors and Skeletal Mages increases their sacrifice bonuses by 60%. And then we want the Bone Storm skill. This is going to give us damage reduction, a massive crit chance bonus which we need, and is constantly available through our cooldown resets. And again, the modifiers here are Prime Bone Storm, so your damage reduction is increased by 15% while it is active, and Supreme Bone Storm, where your critical strike chance is increased by 20%. And then finally, to bring it all home, we take the Shadow Blight Key passive. This skill is going to single-handedly help us ramp very highly our corpse explosion damage. And you can see when shadow damage infects enemies with Shadow Blight for 2 seconds, you and your minions deal 10% damage to enemies with Shadow Blight. Now the key here is every 10th time an enemy receives shadow damage from you or your minions with Corpse Explosion is going to be happening very often. It means they take an additional amount of shadow damage, and again this can ramp to become very high amounts of damage very quickly. And then next for our Book of the Dead, you're going to want Skeletal Warriors. You're going to want right here where you deal 15% increased shadow damage, but you can no longer raise Skeletal Warriors. And then for Skeletal Mages, you're going to want right here for Cold, where you deal 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, but you can no longer raise Skeletal Mages again. And then for Golems, we're going to want for the Iron category, where you deal 30% increased critical strike damage, but you lose the ability to summon a Golem, which we won't need at all. And that's ideally exactly how you should set up your Book of the Dead or this build to get the highest damage output out of it. So now let's go over the gear very quickly. So first of all, you can see for our helmet, we have 9.8% healing received. We have lucky hit chance while you have a barrier, which is a big bump to our lucky hit chance. You definitely want that if you can get it. 6.4% cooldown reduction for our cooldowns, and plus 4 ranks of Decrepify, giving us even higher slow and damage reduction numbers. So for our helmet, you can see the aspect we're using is the Explosive Mist aspect, where Bloodmist triggers corpse explosion on surrounding corpses. When Bloodmist detonates a corpse, its cooldown is reduced by 0.5 seconds, and this is a max roll, so this is going to highly reduce our cooldown resets. And again, on top of that, Bloodmist will make us invincible, especially while doing damage with this. And it helps so that way we trigger a lot of corpse explosions to do massive amounts of damage. You can also see we have rubies in our gear to give us max life. Another great thing to run for this is Aspect of the Protector, so that way we get use of the actual barrier itself. And so we're just going to be running this on our chest. Now, additionally, we want all stats, so that way we can meet a majority amount of our Paragon requirements. shadow damage to greatly increase our overall damage from corpse explosion and other skills, damage reduction from close enemies if possible, and damage reduction from distant enemies or some other kind of damage reduction, whatever you think best fits this build. And then we also have damage reduction from distant enemies, giving us damage reduction in basically every scenario, which will play back up again to our invulnerability from Bloodmist, giving us an extra damage reduction boost overall. And then for our gloves, we have Howl from Below. These are the Ancestral Unique gloves. Now this is an essential piece to this build because it gives us massive increases to our corpse explosion damage, and it allows the corpses to actually seek out enemies, to detonate, and give us huge amounts of AoE damage. So this is a must-have piece. If you find it, make sure you don't lose it because this is an important part to the build. Now, as you can see, this comes with lucky hit chance in general, greatly increasing that, which we really need on this build. Corpse skill attack speed, which in this case is very great. A decent lucky hit chance to stun enemies, and again, our lucky hit chance is already very good, so we'll be stunning enemies very frequently with this and other skills. And overall corpse explosions damage is increased by 39%. Next are our pants, so we're using aspect of Shielding Storm here, and you can see again we're stacking damage reduction from close enemies, damage reduction while fortified. If you can get this on another piece, then great. Plus 23 all stats to again meet our Paragon requirements as much as possible. And then plus 4 ranks of corpse explosion, which is an absolute again must have because it cranks up our overall corpse explosion damage drastically by having that plus 4 ranks there. You can see this aspect: each time that Bone Storm damages an enemy, gain a barrier equal to 4% of your base life for 10 seconds. So we're going to be constantly damaging enemies with Bone Storm because of our massive cooldown reductions. We'll be able to keep the Bone Storm ability up almost constantly, giving us an almost constant barrier. And then our boots here with the Ghost Walkers aspect on them. You can see we have plus 3 ranks to corpse tendrils, another thing you definitely want. You also obviously want movement speed as high as you can get, movement speed upon killing an elite for 4 seconds, and intelligence also works well with this build. Next is going to be our primary weapon, which is our wand. Now you can see one of the reasons you want to use a wand is because you get the constant affix of lucky hit chance at the top, which is maxed out, perfect, exactly what we need. And then critical strike damage for this build, damage to close enemies is fine, plus 69 intelligence for our overall main stat, and 12% damage to affected by shadow damage over time enemies, which is always going to apply on this build. You can see our aspect here, which is the blighted aspect, actually available in the Codex of Power if you need it, where in this case you do 113% increased damage for 6 seconds after the Shadow Blight key passive damages enemies 10 times. And keep in mind, we do want Amethyst here for that damage over time additional effect. Next is our stones. You can see the skills here. We have flat cooldown reduction at the top as the main affix for the stone, which is huge for our build. We also have Fortify Generation, which we want to maintain and generate as much Fortify as possible, since we'll be getting a ton of Fortify through our skills. Again, critical strike chance here is important. Again, barrier generation here for our constant barrier uptime. And then plus 5.4% lucky hit chance while you have a barrier, which again will apply because we'll always be maintaining that barrier. Again, we want the conceited aspect here, so that way we deal 25% increased damage while you have a barrier active, which will have constant uptime on. And again, the amethyst here for 8% damage over time again as well. Next, we're going to move on to our ring. So you can see we have lucky hit chance again here, an extremely important part of this build. Fortify generation again, critical strike damage again, and again damage to affected by shadow damage over time enemies. And our aspect of decay, where each time the Shadow Blight key passive deals damage to enemies, it increases the next Shadow Blight's damage within 10 seconds by 38%, stacking up to 5 times. And you can see here we have the caged heart on this ring, so when at least one enemy nears you, you gain an aura that automatically curses surrounding enemies with Decrepify for 21 seconds. This is an essential heart to have because it's going to give us constant cooldown regeneration for our abilities such as Bloodmist, allowing us to have maximum uptime on those. And then we have our secondary ring, where again we have damage to affected by shadow damage over time enemies, damage to slowed enemies in this case, critical strike damage, and critical strike chance. Again, this is one of the things, if you could get lucky hit chance here, you can take it, but damage to slowed enemies is just fine. And then the blood soaked aspect is what we have on this ring. So blood mist leaves a trail that lasts for 4 seconds and deals a certain amount of shadow damage per second to enemies who stand in it. And it makes it so your movement speed is no longer reduced while blood mist is active. So when we cast blood mist, this is going to restore our full movement speed, making it much easier to move around even though we're already invincible. And that pool shadow that's on the ground allows us to scale for the Shadow Blight crits, which can help increase our overall damage output. And then the caged heart we want here is the vicious heart. So we're walking near a corpse, automatically activates an equipped corpse skill every second, dealing 32% reduced damage. And this is going to make it so that the heart triggers our corpses automatically. We get free explosions out of them, free tendrils, and if we're in blood mist, and we don't even do reduced damage because we aren't technically walking near the corpses, giving us those automatically equipped skills without the actual damage reduction the way this is set up. And then finally our amulet here, where we have damage reduction again from close enemies, 15% increased movement speed, which you want to make you very fast, 21.7% darkness skill damage. So again, we get that additional skill damage from darkness abilities, which would be our main corpse explosion ability, and then that overall 7.2% damage reduction. We also have the aspect of grasping veins here, so you gain 21% increased critical strike chance for 6 seconds when you cast corpse tendrils. You also deal 42% bonus critical strike damage to enemies damaged by corpse tendrils, and this is extremely huge and a must-have. Again, we're going to have a super high critical strike chance overall. With the additional damage, we're going to be critting for an insane amount of additional damage with this aspect on. And then here we want the Wrathful Barber Heart, so that critical strikes and all subsequent damage within 3.7 seconds is absorbed by your target. Then the absorbed damage erupts onto surrounding enemies, and because of this, it's going to absorb all of our damage after we crit, which is going to be immediately. It's going to count all crits and all of our shadow damage. And once it detonates, the screen actually gets nuked for millions upon millions of damage. Finally, we're going to go over the Paragon board so I can show you Ali's perfect Paragon setup for this. And ideally for the starting board, you're going to want to set the territorial glyph here, which is going to allow us to max out our close target damage, which will basically always be the case because we're always going to be grouping up and fighting close enemies, giving us a bunch of extra damage here. And you just again want to copy these nodes as you see them on the screen for extra damage, again extra armor and extra damage. Next, we're going to take the Wither board, and this will have the darkness glyph socketed, so that way we get increased shadow damage for our build, which synchronizes perfectly with all of our abilities and damage. And then the additional bonus here, whenever you or your minions deal shadow damage to an enemy, that enemy deals 2% reduced damage up to 10% for 5 seconds, giving us even better damage reduction from this darkness glyph. One thing I do want to mention is you do want to make sure you grab the Wither node over here. This is going to give us shadow damage over time effects, where we can get up to a 50% bonus damage increase each time they deal damage. And again, you want to make sure you grab this rare node to increase damage reduction for yourself. And then some of these other rare nodes like this will increase our shadow damage and shadow damage over time. The next, we want to jump over here for our third board and use the Flesh Eater board. So here we're going to socket the Essence glyph, and this is going to give us increased critical strike damage and a pretty decent amount of it once we max this glyph out. Then we're going to have critical strikes deal 22% increased damage to enemies that are not healthy. So enemies, after we get them past that initial phase of healthy and almost full health, we're going to do additional increased damage to them as well. And again, this is that multiplicative damage increase. And then we're going to want to grab the legendary node Flesh Eater here. So consuming 5 corpses grants 40% increased damage for 6 seconds. And that means we're going to proc that fairly often. Then for our final board for right now, even though we still will only have 42 points left, so there will be one additional board after this. This board is going to be the Scent of Death board with the Control glyph. This is going to increase our damage to crowd controlled enemies, which procs almost all the time. And the additional bonus where you and your minions deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or 20% to stunned or frozen enemies. Again, all the enemies we fight are going to meet the either slowed or stunned, so we're going to deal constant additional damage with that as well. Again, you want to make sure here you grab the legendary node Scent of Death, so with at least 2 corpses nearby, you get 15% damage reduction, meaning we're going to get a constant uptime state for the most part of damage reduction. And then the rare node over here for damage to healthy enemies and critical strike damage, as well as the surrounding magic nodes. But this is the ideal Paragon setup that is going to take you and let you do millions of damage and wipes out groups of enemies and bosses at the exact same time within 2 to 3 seconds with basically one or a couple casts of a skill. Again, here for our DPS rotation, initially we use Reap here to generate corpses, and it also applies that initial damage reduction. And then we can use Bone Storm, giving us a solid amount of damage reduction and massive crit chance bonus, which is going to be great when paired with our corpse explosion ability. And when timed right, giving us even higher crits. We can then use Decrepify to slow enemies, reduce damage from enemies, and most importantly with Decrepify, we're going to be able to again refresh those cooldowns of all of our abilities, especially our primary ability, Bloodmist. And again, Bloodmist is going to make us invincible in this rotation, so you want to have Bloodmist active as much as possible. And again, paired with that aspect on our gear, it's not only going to make us invulnerable, but it's going to allow us again to detonate corpses with it through that explosive mist aspect. Now again, before we use our corpse explosion, we're going to want to use corpse tendrils, so that way we can apply infinite CC with our cooldown resets, give vulnerable damage to groups of enemies, and group them all up together to get ready for a massive corpse explosion, as well as our Barber Heart explosion damage. And then our corpse explosion ability, which is our big damage ability, which scales and stacks a lot of crit and shadow damage that are combined with the Shadow Blight passive and all of our other abilities on this build. And then upon pairing that with Bloodmist to make us invulnerable and getting all the detonated corpses, as well as the damage from the Barber Heart, this is going to give us, as you can see, huge amounts of explosive damage to enemies and keep enemies in a tight group with corpse tendrils and just level them with corpse explosion damage. So again, make sure you check the build link in the description. And then follow AliGotRange below. He's the one who brought this build to me. So go subscribe to him, and if you run this Necromancer build, you will never go back because it is insanely fun to play. Also, make sure to check out this video on the left hand side of the screen so you don't make these critical mistakes in Season 1.